Good evening to all who have joined us today for this event on African swine fever. I would like to welcome you to the second series of webinars on how to prevent African swine fever. In this occasion, we're going to be speaking about the risk analysis. My name is Erika Calderon. I work for the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation and Agriculture, IICA, and we shall begin now with the opening of today's event. We're going to be having some opening remarks by Dr. Carlos Moreno from OIRSA. He is in the position in OIRSA as Animal Health Officer and Coordinator of the Regional Program on Poultry Health with technical support of the country and the region. Dr. Moreno has been in the outbreak of African swine fever in the Dominican Republic and has provided technical advisory and accompaniment to veterinary services of that country. Without further ado, Dr. Moreno, the floor is yours. Go ahead. Thank you very much, Erika. It's such a pleasure to see you and to greet you all. As Erika has been mentioned, we are here in the Dominican Republic, constantly supporting the country with this unfortunate outbreak of African swine fever. I am here on behalf of the regional director of the organization who had previous engagements, so he had to attend a different activity. So it is my turn today to give you the welcome remarks. For us, it's a pleasure as an organization to be able to share under the OIRSA scheme to promote these actions as countries, as regions, Latin America, and the Caribbean, so that we are paying close attention to reinforce all control measures for prevention of this disease in the countries that fortunately do not have the disease yet. It's important to highlight that this is a disease that we have had to experience. This is not just a health component, but it also unleashes several topics in relation to social and cultural components, economic topics, and health and political issues go hand in hand, which makes this disease harder to control. In our case here in the Dominican Republic, we have to have an effective eradication. In this case, what the intention is that through international organizations, we can provide these training sessions and technical support to all technical experts in Latin America and the Caribbean in order to be able to begin establishing all specific controls and strengthen the measures to be prepared, and paying close attention to any event that at any time might suggest any suspicion of the disease. As to safety, quarantine systems, the strength of the labs, communication on epidemiology in the first place is something that we're going to be looking at today, which is in relation to risk analysis. This helping the countries have the strengths of reanalyzing, address and look within their systems what can be done to improve efficiency systems for quarantine inspection. Thank you, Erica. Welcome, friends, on behalf of the organization. Hopefully this information is beneficial for all. Thank you. Thank you very much, Carlos. Following, we're going to have some remarks by Dr. Giovanni Gutierrez. He is the chairman of CaribVET, and he is the director of the official animal health safety in Cuba. Go ahead, Dr. Gutierrez. Your mic is off. Thank you, Erika and other colleagues. I would like to read the words that I have prepared for you on behalf of the presidency of the steering committee of CaribVET. We warmly welcome you to this series of seminars dedicated to of the veterinary services of Caribbean, Latin America, just as all the other institutions that are participating in this series of 4 seminars dedicated to the risk analysis. Today, we're going to begin on November 9th, and we will conclude on December 7th, according to the agenda that has been circulated by IICA. As we already know, the Interinstitutional Alliance Against African Swine Fever began organizing in September these workshops. And our dear Professor Jose Manuel Sanchez Vizcaíno was in charge of the general introduction. And we have decided to hold a series of 4 seminars. We're going to be presenting risk analysis fundamentals, risk assessment tools for this analysis developed by the Caribbean, assessment of biosafety, and the presentation of the risk survey prepared by FAO. Later on, we're going to have other webinars for detection and response, and also on an outbreak of African swine fever. It is also important to remember that by the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s, the African swine fever affected several countries: Cuba twice in 71 and 80, Brazil, the Dominican Republic in 1978, and Haiti in 1979. The control and eradication in all cases brought a very negative balance for the affected countries due to the eradication measures applied. Currently, the epidemiological situation of African swine fever continues to be complex worldwide. And in our region, where after an epidemiological silence of more than 40 years, outbreaks have been diagnosed in the Dominican Republic and Haiti, which requires addressing and implement effective strategic disease management and control measures. For this, the guiding principles of the GFTATs, based on the knowledge acquired through research and with the participation of all interested parties, have been recognized as the most effective approach and makes us try to achieve together better knowledge of the risk of introduction and spread of the disease, as well as emergency preparedness and response capacities. We're convinced that during the development of these seminars, which will be given by an excellent panel of experts, with the knowledge acquired, dialogue, and professional exchange that we will develop, we will be better prepared to implement in each of our countries the regional strategy for containing and preventing the spread of this disease, which we recently approved on September 29th, 2021, under the framework of the GFTATs. So on behalf of our steering committee and our presidency of CaribVET, I invite you to take advantage of these 4 working sessions, and we officially declare the beginning of our seminars. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Gutierrez. And to finalize these opening session, we have a few words by Ana Marisa Cordero. She is the manager of our Animal Health and Food Safety Program at IICA. Go ahead, Ana Marisa. Thank you, Erika. I would like to send my warm greetings to the people who are with us today. First of all, to my colleagues here on the main table, Giovanni and Carlos, thank you very much for your remarks. Also, our speakers for today. Thank you very much for your commitment and your interest for participating in this initiative. Also, a special recognition to all the cooperation agencies, international organizations, and countries that accompany this coordination effort between agencies, among agencies for training on African swine fever. What I would like to say is that this is another example of how the commitment by all can really help build capacities for the different representatives of the official services of the productive sector to better know about this topic and to see how we can face this challenge in a better manner. As mentioned, this is an effort that began a few weeks ago, and this is an initiative that shall continue with this series of webinars to be held until the month of December, but it does not end here. The idea is that we all together may continue working and identifying topics that are a priority to continue supporting, strengthening, and capacity building, sharing experiences, and to identify actions that may contribute to improve not only the performance of official services, but also that may contribute to the implementation of actions to adequately face this challenge. I want just to thank Erica for this coordination effort together with the people who are with us, and also to all the participants we have today, not only in Zoom, but who are with us through our social networks. Thank you very much. I really hope that today's webinar and the upcoming ones really contribute to improving knowledge, help us learn, share experiences, and to continue working on this subject. Thank you very much, and thank you. Thank you, Erica. Thank you. Okay, with these words, we begin with this event. It is important to state that this webinar has been coordinated, as has been said already by the speakers. It has been coordinated by an interagency partnership on training against African swine fever that arose within the framework of the GFTATs, with the mandate of this group coordinating the training on African swine fever to prepare countries in America and the Caribbean in the prevention of this disease. We are comprised by different agencies like OIRSA, OAE, FAO, CaribVET, CAPSA, COPEG, LACAN, USDA, CVP, with under the leadership of IICA. As was also mentioned before, this is a series that of webinars that has been dedicated to the risk analysis. It will be dedicated to this topic, even though each webinar is separate from the other. We advise to attend to the complete series so that you can have a better knowledge of how to perform risk analysis, the tools to do this, and the result of some recent risk analysis held. As was also said before, this is fundamentals for risk analysis, but we're also going to have next week on November 16th, a workshop on practical tools for risk prevention, November 30th, on risk analysis at the farm, and on December 7th, results for risk analysis in African swine fever for Latin America and the Caribbean. So without further ado, let's go on to the core of this activity, and we will introduce the panelists. We have Dr. Dana Cole. She is from USDA. Dr. Cole works for the Epidemiology Center in Animal Health in the Department of Agriculture of the United States, Animal Safety and Plant Safety Inspection Services. Dr. Cole is currently an Associate Director in the Center for Epidemiology and Animal Health of Veterinary Services of USDA. She supervises 3 units that are responsible for a variety of analytical geospatial and risk analysis elements, and as well as economic assessment. These efforts help veterinary services determining the political needs, commercial and international needs as well, and to design prevention and control strategies for transporter and internal threats for plants and animals. Dr. Cole was graduated from
de la Universidad de California
as a veterinary medicine doctor from the University of California at Davis, and she has a major in large animals from 1997. 2002, she received her PhD from the University of North Carolina. And I'm going to introduce to you also Dr. Eric Ether. Dr. Eric Ether is a veterinary who's an epidemiologist and he is currently Secretary in the Caribbean in Guadeloupe, in the Caribbean. He is an extraordinary professor in the Department of Study of Production Animals at the School of Veterinary Sciences of the University of Pretoria, South Africa. Professor Etter is a recognized internationally expert on risk analysis. He has published more than 60 articles in international journals. Under his supervision or co-supervision, we had 5 PhD students and 15 master's degree students have graduated. He has also supervised and co-supervised 6 PhD and 2 master's degree students. His dissertation is centered on different diseases like vector transmitted diseases like the Western Nile virus, the Rift Valley fever, zoonotic diseases like brucellosis, etc. And also other diseases with very important economic consequences that affect farmers, but also whole countries due to the prohibition on exports. His functions are assessing classical innovative methods to determine risk factors in order to propose improvements and most profitable strategies to control these diseases. He included in his research approaches on social sciences for surveillance and control of diseases. With this important CVs of our 2 speakers today, I open up the floor to Drs. Cole and Etter for them to begin with their session for today. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully you can all see my screen now, my slides. I want to thank my host today for giving myself and my colleague, Dr. Eric Etter, the opportunity to share with you some fundamentals of risk analysis for African swine fever. Our focus today will be determining the pathways of entry and risks of spread and establishment in host countries. So the basics of risk analysis has 4 components. The first component is hazard identification. During the hazard identification, the particulars of the pathogen are described. In this phase of the conduct of a risk analysis, it's really important to determine all the different ways that a pathogen can manifest in animals. So the clinical signs, whether they're subclinical infections, how likely it is to detect the infection. So consideration of diagnostics, consideration of the clinical manifestation in animals, consideration of how it is spread. Is it spread by aerosol? Is it spread by direct contact, indirect contact by animals? And all the different aspects of the epidemiology of the pathogen itself. And in this stage, it will set the stage for all the subsequent steps by very carefully outlining the epidemiology and virulence factors and other aspects of the pathogen. You set the stage for what will be included in the risk assessment by way of pathways of entry, pathways of exposure, and how you can anticipate the pathogen will be spread among populations in the country if introduced. The second component of a risk analysis is the risk assessment, which is what we're going to focus on in this seminar today. During the risk assessment, you need to consider the entry assessment. How will the pathogen get into the country? During the entry assessment, you consider all possible infectious materials, live animals or other tissues or fomites that may enter a country and be contaminated and expose susceptible pig populations. During the exposure assessment, you consider for every pathway of entry that you have outlined, you want to consider how a susceptible pig or population of pigs may be exposed. And then the consequence assessment. What happens after exposure, establishment, and spread of a pathogen in susceptible pig populations. What would be the consequences of that introduction and spread of disease in the country? And finally, all these components in the risk assessment culminate in a risk estimation. The third component of a risk analysis is risk management. The steps to risk management are going to be directly informed by the previous steps, obviously, by determining the hazard, identifying how the hazard will manifest in populations, how it will be spread, and then conducting a risk assessment where methods, pathways of entry, pathways of exposure and spread and establishment are established, the consequences of that spread and establishment, and then finally risk estimation are going to directly impact how you manage that risk. And we'll go into more detail there when we consider how to mitigate or decrease your total risk of African swine fever spread. And then finally, risk communication. The risk communication portion of a risk analysis is a collaboration. You want to make sure that all those who may be part of the process of preventing entry or spread or establishment are included in your risk communication. In order to be effective with your risk management, you need to establish partnerships between your industry, government, academic centers. It truly is a partnership of all involved in a country to effectively manage and communicate risks once you've completed all the risk assessment steps. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to focus largely on the risk assessment phase and provide you an overview and some tools for how to conduct a risk assessment with a focus, of course, on African swine fever. So the risk assessment, as I just outlined, has 4 steps. First, the entry assessment, where you identify the pathways of hazard entry into the country. The exposure assessment, for each entry pathway, you want to estimate the likelihood of animal exposure to the pathogen, or in this case, African swine fever. The process of exposure entry assessment and exposure assessment, you're going to be estimating both likelihood. So how likely is it, or what is the probability that a pathogen may enter in any given pathway? And what is the likelihood that an animal will be exposed if the pathogen does enter in that pathway? For each of these, you're also going to estimate uncertainty. How confident are you in your likelihood estimate? And I'll go into more detail in subsequent slides. There's also the consequence assessment, as I mentioned. For each pathway of entry, one estimates the impacts of establishment and spread of the hazard. And then risk estimation. So for each pathway, the estimated risk of all the subsequent steps happening and culminating into an impact is estimated, pulling together each of the estimates and each of the phases that preceded into a final risk estimation.
Dana?
So that's,
sorry.
Yes.
Before entering in the details of the risk assessment, I wanted to present the context of risk analysis in the international trade.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks. Okay. Okay, so we've seen the definition of risk analysis in its detail, but I wanted to come back a little bit on the context of risk analysis, particularly with sorry, I don't see the screen, but do you see my screen? Yeah. So the fact that risk analysis on trade is coming from the development of the World Trade Organization, but we have to go back to last centuries, where we had the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, who launched the different rounds of negotiation, and the last one being between 1986 and 1994, which was called the Eurograde round negotiation, and because it started in Eurograde, and the last meeting was in Marrakesh, where there was the Marrakesh Agreement, which established, in fact, the World Trade Organization. And during this meeting, there was also a presentation of the multilateral agreement on trade in goods, which included what we called the SPS agreement, which for sanitary and phytosanitary agreements, and the limitation of this SPS restriction to the international exchange. And it came from the obvious constatation that zero risk is incompatible with active trade, and there was a liberty on the level of protection chosen by each country. Therefore, restrictions on trades could only be supported by science, which means risk analysis, and this restriction should be transparent. And the international rules will be established by international organization of reference, and namely the International Convention for Vegetal Protection regarding the trade of plants, the Codex Alimentarius regarding the trade for food and feed, and the OIE for the trade of animal and animal products. If we look a little bit more in depth in this SPS agreement, we will directly see in the second article that the level of protection should be based on scientific principle, which means that there is an obligation of scientific justification of the sanitary and phytosanitary measures based on risk assessment, as defined by Dana before. And these sanitary and phytosanitary measures should be harmonized as widely as possible between the different members. And therefore, some guidelines should be developed, and these international standards and guidelines have been developed by this international organization. And regarding animal health and zoonosis, the standard guidelines and recommendations were developed by the OIRSA. Looking at Article 5, we have an explanation of what was thought about assessment of risk. And as developed here, it was referred to these three relevant international organizations, so the Codex, the OIE, and IPPC. And in the assessment of risk, members shall take into account scientific evidence, relevant process and production methods. So for our case with pig, all the pig production, the pig systems, the relevant inspection, sampling, and testing methods, so the work of the veterinary services, the prevalence of specific disease or pests, or in our case, the prevalence of African swine fever, the existence of the pest or disease in 3 areas, and the relevant ecological and environmental conditions, You will see that more in depth looking at the risk assessment for entry and exposure. And also all the measures taken by the countries to prevent the disease, such as quarantine or other treatment. I was talking firstly about transparency. It means that all the sources of information should be given when a risk assessment is done. In this risk assessment, all methods and processes should be clearly identified. The argument and assumption leading to conclusion and decisions should be highlighted. And as already mentioned by Dana, the uncertainty should be described and data gaps identified to guide incoming researches. In addition to this agreement, the World Trade Organization produces this analytical index, which is a guide in terms of law and practices, article by article, to the interpretation and application of the World Trade Organization agreements. And for each of the article of the SPS agreement, you will be able to see all the jurisprudence that have been developed and also the practice. So if you go directly on the website of the World Trade Organization, you will be directed to all this information. And you see, for example, here for the Article 5 of SPS agreement, you will have the jurisprudence first, and also all the development of the practice that have been developed. Okay, Dinah, I give you back the screen for the continuation.
Thank you. So with that as an overview and background to the importance both to individual countries and to their policies, international trade policies, we'll start off on each step, providing an overview on each step of the risk assessment process, starting with entry assessment. So during the entry assessment, you need to consider for your country all the different pathways or ways that infectious animals or animal tissues and animal products could enter your borders. These could be, as you can see from my graphic, these can be via imports, so cargo ships of products for commercial production, can be a pathway for either live pigs or pig products, pork products, or it could be informal pathways. My graphics of suitcases and cargo and footsteps. So every country has a large volume of people.
Dana, can you share your screen, please?
Oh, sorry. What would I do without Eric watching me here?
Thank you.
Thank you. So, yes, much better if you can see my screen. Better now. So for each of these, so the gray represents the border, so a port of entry, and you can see you need to consider, again, all the different ways that either animals that could arrive or their products, either their tissues, meat products, blood products, any sort of infectious tissue that may be imported either formally through imported commercial products, either pigs being imported for commercial use within a country, and also informally via international travelers. So I have the graphic here of suitcases and packages. So products can be enter into a country through luggage from travelers coming from an ASF infected country. They can be shipped in the mail, in packages, and just the movement. If a person is visiting on farms in an ASF country or other areas where there's infected animals, they could actually carry virus on their shoes. So a consideration of all the pathways can be quite extensive when you consider both the formal commercial routes and then the informal or human routes of just everyday international travel and activities and shipping of products. And so for each of these entry pathways, then you have an arrow, a pathway that designates a pathway that needs to then be considered for exposure. And I give you a bit of snapshot here, and we'll come back to this later in the presentation. Let's see. There we go. So there's a variety of factors to consider when you're thinking of entry. Eric has already presented some of these when, when he outlined the SPS requirements. So things that need to be considered when you're considering the probability or likelihood that the pathogen will enter on any given product or any given animal is the prevalence of the virus in the area. So how widespread is the virus or is the pathogen in populations in a source country? What processing steps are included that may kill the virus prior to its arrival at entry? So is the product fully processed with a heat step such that entry of the product no longer represents a contaminated product? Control programs in the affected region. So what impact do control programs or quarantines or limitations have on that risk of entry? And then inspection practices. These are all examples of things to consider when you're considering the likelihood that a product from any given country or region or animal may be contaminated or infected with African swine fever. You also need to consider, because it directly informs the likelihood, the quantity of animals in products. Obviously, the higher the quantity or the number of animals and the higher the quantity of shipments entering into the country, the higher the risk that any one of those or more than one may be contaminated or infected. So that's going to impact your estimate of the probability or likelihood of entry. The frequency of importation. Are these imports happening on a daily basis, multiple times a day, or is it very rare that a live animal, for example, is going to enter the country from an ASF infected region because there's already policies in place to prevent that? The survival during the transport. Of course, this is going to depend on the proximity of a country to an affected country. If it's across a land border, and a country is neighboring a positive country, of course, that survival is going to be very likely. If it's a product is coming across the ocean, the survival may be much lower. Unfortunately, in the case of African swine fever, it is a very stable virus. So it has been demonstrated recently by science to survive quite a long time. So in the case of African swine fever, that survival during transport is an important factor in the likelihood of entry because it can't be expected or assumed that it will die in transit over a long transport across an ocean, for example. And then finally, what is the likelihood of detection? So depending on processes at the port, inspection of live animals, for example, that are coming into a country. What is the probability or likelihood that the animal or the infected materials is detected at the port of entry and never makes it into the country, is confiscated or is not allowed in the country? So that will also impact the likelihood that the virus successfully enters the country and potentially exposes susceptible pigs. So I have here a pathway as an example to demonstrate that there's two methods of estimating likelihood. Ideally, you have data and you can assign actual probabilities to your pathway and then multiply these probabilities and get a very quantitative estimate of your likelihood. That is the ideal scenario. So in this diagram, you can see that we have our pigs in our origin country, and if we had the data where we could directly estimate what is the probability that pigs entering the country are infected with ASF, we could estimate that probability directly. And then we could estimate directly what is the probability that it would be detected, a live animal in this case, detected at the border and never be admitted to the country or released to expose a susceptible population. However, it's very rare, as I'm sure you can imagine, to actually have quantitative data where you can go through each step and each question in your pathway and determine an actual quantitative estimate. So most of the time, I would venture to say our risk assessments need to be qualitative in nature. And that is, we assign a risk based on a category, a low risk, a medium risk, or a high risk, for example, to the event happening based on our scientific judgment, and qualitative measures that we may have to assess risks within our country. Again, as Eric highlighted, we need to be well-grounded in the scientific literature to estimate our risks. And because no likelihood estimate is absolute, we need to determine how confident are we in our estimates of likelihood. Again, if you are looking at a quantitative estimate, it may be statistical uncertainty that you can estimate. But more likely, if you're looking at qualitative, and even in the case of quantitative, you need to evaluate the quality of your data that you're using to estimate your likelihood. So factors that will influence your level of confidence or certainty in your likelihood estimate is the data. For example, there are some areas where data may just not be available, such as what is the likelihood that a pig infected with African swine fever virus is illegally brought into your country. For example, if your country does not allow importation of live animals at the border from ASF infected countries, then maybe the illegal pathway is a very concerning pathway, but you have no data to estimate how likely the live pigs are brought in illegally. And then how reliable is the data? Again, if you think about the illegal pathways or all of the numerous pathways that I showed before of international travel, how reliable can you estimate the number of persons coming in that may have contaminated pork products in their luggage, or maybe mailing pork products to family members in your country? Again, availability of data and reliability of the data are going to be factors to consider in how confident are you in your estimate. And then human fallibility to follow protocols. Again, if you do have protocols at the border to prevent entry, what is the error associated with implementation of those protocols? No system is perfect. Sources of bias, not data usually has a reason to be collected that isn't necessarily what you're using it for. So there may be data in your country on how many international passengers come in on airlines, but then maybe that is a biased look because it doesn't consider other pathways or other entry points. Assumptions, every analysis is going to have assumptions. You may have to assume that a certain number of illegal pigs will be brought into your country by by immigrants or by other mechanisms. And you may have to make some assumptions to get a likelihood estimate. And then I mentioned already variance in your parameter estimates. If you're using quantitative data, there's always going to be variance and uncertainty. And then the analytical method, again, if you're using quantitative methods and even surveillance design, each surveillance system has elements of design that where we know we're not detecting or testing everything. So we must consider our surveillance design and what are we missing? What is it not capturing? What is the probability of detection based on our surveillance design? These are all sources of uncertainty that are going to estimate that are going to factor into how confident you are in your likelihood estimates or your probability estimates. So here's my pathway again. And I've mentioned you have quantitative sources of uncertainty based on statistical confidence intervals, but more likely, again, you're going to be estimating your uncertainty categorically based on you have a very low level of uncertainty. You feel very confident in your estimate because you have strong data and you're confident in your data, or you may have a high level of uncertainty because you actually have no data or you have limited data or you're using proxy information and you have a high level of uncertainty in your likelihood estimate. Again, I've mentioned you need to consider in all your pathways, both legal and illegal pathways, and both formally or commercially imported materials and also materials arriving with human movements such as immigration or international travel. So I want to emphasize again, because it's easy to overlook these human activity pathways. Again, there's usually very little data to inform it, but they can be very important in your assessment of risk because these are inadvertent or accidental introductions. And so they must be considered thoroughly, such as tourism, or I mentioned smuggling or black market trade, movement of products in personal vehicles or boats. If you have high tourism or cross-border traffic in tourists. And then again, I mentioned pathogens on soiled clothing or shoes if persons are going back and forth across borders and visiting ASF infected farms. So as we consider these pathways, you can see compared to my initial little snapshot, they can get very complicated quickly. So here's another look at pathways looking from the origin country. You want to think all through all the opportunities for either the animal, in this case, to be detected and then removed so that it does not result in exposure, or not detected and then continue into the pathway of potential exposure to susceptible pigs. So again, this is a very long pathway looking at imported live pigs that may go to slaughter. Their products at slaughter may be then infected. If they're not thoroughly cooked, they may continue on that pathway and be exported. And if they have virus, then consideration of survival of the virus on the product after it's during exportation and importation. And then what are the protocols at the border that may remove this product at the border, in which case, again, it will not go on to exposure. So this is one simple pathway of consideration of live pigs, then in a host country, then going to slaughter and resulting in pork products that may be imported into a country. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague again to talk about consequence assessment. Or do you want me to finish with exposure assessment? Oh, sorry.
No.
I apologize. Eric's going to show some tools, an example from CaribVET on how to evaluate an entry pathway. I apologize. Go ahead, Eric.
Okay. So as mentioned by Dana, I will show you this tool that has been developed by CaribVET, and it will be developed next week more in depth, but this is more or less a sort of an introduction for you to these tools. You will already see part of it. So it's the presentation of the tool is an Excel file, and I did some screenshot of this Excel file just for you to see and to highlight the different components. So as described by Dana, you've seen that for the entry assessment, you will need to decompose the different steps from the presence of the disease to the entry of the disease in your country. So the first thing, as mentioned before, is to define. Sorry?
Can you put the presentation?
You don't have the presentation? Oh, sorry. So a problem. So let me share.
We were seeing it, just to be sure to have it on full screen, please.
Do you see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So as I said, in this tool, you will see the different steps, and the first one being the definition of the disease prevalence. So this tool has been developed, as mentioned by Dana, for a qualitative risk assessment, because for quantitative it's more complicated. You need really to have the help of some experts, some statisticians working with probabilities. So it can, and you need also lots of data. So this tool has been developed in order for every veterinary service to be able to do some rapid risk assessment, as defined also by FAO, as we will see a little bit later on. So as mentioned here, you can see here the first step, 1.1, the disease prevalence in the affected country, and you need to assess it as high, medium, or low. So you need to choose a certain level. And you can develop this risk assessment considering importation from different countries. Here you can see we have shown you with 3 different countries, and there, after all, there will be a combination of this different risk for the different country to obtain a global risk. So the first step is to assess the presence of the prevalence of the disease in the different countries. So it could be, as you can see, medium, high, or low. And depending on this level of prevalence, there was a value, a numerical value that is associated to this different level that will allow us at the end to combine the different level of risk. The second step is the disease distribution in the affected country, to see if the whole country is affected or just a part of the country is affected. And as you can see, once again, you've got numerical value, and obviously the value, if all the country is affected, is higher than if just a part of the country is affected. The third step is what are the preventive and control sanitary measures against the disease in the affected country. So we developed that with 3 different questions. If there is an official control program, yes or no. Availability of vaccine and vaccination programs. So obviously for our case of ASF, there is no vaccine. So in our case, it will always be no. And the execution of official program is satisfactory in all the affected region or only in some affected region. And once again, you've got some numerical value associated to this, consideration. So after that, we've got a fourth step, which is a release pathway of the pathogen from the affected country, where we will assess all the factors which determine the introduction of pathogen in your country. So you remember, just explained by Dana, you need to consider the legal trade and the illegal trade of animals, but also of pork and byproducts. Then you will also consider the probability of introduction by person, transport, unanimated object, residues of animal origin. And once again, you need to consider the different ports of entry. So either the terrestrial boundaries, if you have in your country, the international airports, the international seaports, and also the tourist marinas, cruise ship, and yachts that you could have in your country. And once again, according to some consideration, for example, for international airports, we consider the number of flights per week. Some numerical value will be associated to this consideration and will be integrated in the final combination. And the last port of entry could be also as a consequence of disaster situations such as earthquake, hurricane, and others. And finally, you will have to consider the introduction assessment of the virus, ASF virus, in the exposed country. And for that, you will need to consider in your country the number of border control points, the number of border control points without veterinarian control, and also the same consideration at airports, seaport, and in the marina, if you have or not veterinary control, and the number of these different ports of entry. Okay, back to you, Dana. I would suggest the presentation of the exposure assessment before the consequence.
Okay, thank you. So going on to the pathways of exposure, we've seen this graphic before earlier when we were talking about our entry. So from this point forward, in my experience, it goes a bit more quickly to think through all the pathways that products and animals that may have entered may expose your susceptible pig populations. And again, the same estimates are estimated for the likelihood of exposure and the uncertainty that you have in that exposure. So factors that are exposure specific that you want to consider is the likelihood of the virus reaching the pig, of course. The likelihood that a susceptible pig will be exposed and infected will depend on numerous factors, including how are those pigs managed? Are they fed garbage? Is that garbage from landfills that may receive garbage from international ships, from discarded pig products that may be discarded that were received again in a package in cargo. So again, that's going to impact the likelihood of exposure, just those basic pig production practices and feeding practices. There's also wildlife ecology and management to consider. Again, if you have loose or feral pigs on your landscape and they have access to landfills or areas where garbage is disposed of, then there's another pathway of exposure for wildlife. And how are those wildlife managed on that landscape? What is the likelihood that a wildlife once infected will then expose a domestic pig population. Other factors to consider an exposure, of course, are sanitary measures. So what measures are in place to reduce the presence of virus in products? We talked about kill steps associated with heating up sausages, for example, and killing any virus in it. Are there other sanitary measures such as inspection programs at the port where infectious animals are tested or observed and may be detected at port and not allowed entry into the country? Again, these would be legal pathways. Or are there quarantine programs where animals are held at a port for quarantine and testing before they're allowed? These are going to impact how likely it is that an exposed or infected pig or product actually makes it into the country and exposes susceptible animals. And the presence of reservoirs, alternative populations such as tick vectors that may enter a country, or we mentioned wildlife. Wildlife, if you have land borders, don't honor borders. So what are the opportunities for infected free roaming pigs to cross a border into the country that may be infected? So getting back to the pathway diagram, I find it very helpful if you think through your entry and exposure in a pathway diagram such as this, because it allows you to visualize each step where either a infected product may continue down the pathway to ultimately exposing susceptible pigs, or opportunities where that product, in this case, is confiscated or consumed and doesn't reach a landfill, or maybe incinerated after it came across the border. So this particular pathway, as you can see, starts with the entry point of a infected sausage, for example, being carried by an international traveler into a country, and then an outline of each step where maybe that product does not continue on to ultimately expose pigs. It may be consumed, incinerated. It may go to a landfill. Perhaps the landfill is protected and there is no access to contaminated products. But then, as I mentioned, there may be garbage feeding pigs at that landfill, or free roaming pigs, in which case then there's an opportunity for infection. So biosecurity, again, another mitigation that may be considered. Perhaps these wild pigs or free roaming pigs that had access to a landfill don't ever have exposure again to a commercially produced pig. Maybe biosecurity prevents that exposure. So each step in the pathway should be considered as far as what mitigations may be in place to prevent continuation of that contaminated product to an exposure to a susceptible pig. And with that, we're going to go back to Eric, and he's going to show you the spreadsheet, the tool for and the inputs for exposure assessment. Eric?
Okay, do you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So as previously, I'm just presenting the application of what Dana presented to you in the CaribVET risk assessment tool. For exposure assessment, we've got also different steps with questions you will have to answer. The first one being the assessment of the surveillance of diagnostic capacities for an early warning in your country with different qualitative levels. And we will ask if there is a presence of mandatory reporting system and this disease is included. ASF, either an epidemiological surveillance system with fixed staff and material resource in all regions. The diagnostic group has material resource and vehicle for sampling if necessary. If there are capability for differential diagnosis from endemic diseases, particularly regarding ASF, do you have also classical swine fever in your country, or erysiperal, or other type of disease that could be compared with ASF, and for which you really need this differential diagnosis? And also the timely notification of high mortality and morbidity to the veterinary services. The second step to assess will be the characterization of the pig production systems in your country. So I've seen in the chat there was a question about soft ticks, garrapatas, and this is really one of the questions that you will have to ask. Are there in the country soft ticks of the genus Ornithodorus that can act as a biological factor for ASF virus? And regarding our region, we know that we've got this Ornithodorus Puerto Ricensis that is present, but currently the competence of the disease regarding genotype 2 is not completely clear. There are some work that has been done regarding genotype 1 with this soft ticks, but not yet with genotype 2, which could be quite different. And also, according to the criteria defined in the sheet pig system, you will see in the tool there is a sheet pig systems. So you will have to define what is the predominant production system in your country, and what is the risk of spread of infections through livestock markets and other animal movement in your country. The third step to consider is the industry characterization and the pig products commercial trade. And for these ones, you will have to answer a little bit some quantitative question about the numbers of facilities, the veterinary inspection, the traceability, waste treatment, transport, disinfection, and trash control for the different slaughterhouses, different types of slaughterhouses, and also about the processing plant that could be existing in your country, and the refrigerators. And that's all for the tool. And now I will present to you the third step, which is the risk consequence assessment. Sorry. So let me share this. Okay, can you confirm me that you see correctly my screen?
Yes, Eric, but you have to put in presentation mode.
Okay, this mode is not good. You don't see it like this?
No.
Okay, so
no.
Let me just. Okay. Better like this?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So as defined in the beginning of the session, you remember that in risk assessment, we had 4 steps: the entry assessment, the exposure assessment, the consequence assessment, and the risk estimation. So regarding consequence assessment, if we go back to this sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, you see that it was mentioned that members, so countries, have to take into account relevant economic factors that are linked with the potential loss of production or sales, but also the cost of control or eradication of the disease, and the relative cost effectiveness of alternative approaches to limit the risk. And if you go now in the terrestrial animal health code from Hawaii, that has been updated in 2018, you will see that consequence assessment, the definition, consists of describing the relationship between specified exposures to a biological agent and the consequences of those exposures. So a causal process should exist. So you really need to have not only a statistical relation, but a real causal process between your exposure and the consequences. And then you will have to estimate the probability of these consequences to occur. So you will identify the potential biological, environmental, and economic consequences associated with entry, exposure, and spread of your African swine fever. And if we look, we can distinguish between direct and indirect consequence. In terms of direct consequences, you will have for the animal at several levels, so at farms or national levels, the morbidity and the mortality. And you will need to assess the costs related to these two factors, but also the production losses, and also consider the animal welfare regarding chronic forms and the potential culling of animals that has to be put in place. Regarding indirect consequences, you will have the economical ones with costs of control and eradication or surveillance systems. And for African swine fever, obviously, you will have this question of compensation that you will have to raise and solve in your country. Do we, in case of culling of animals, either in infected zone or on a buffer zone, do we permit or do we allow compensation for the farmers? And what is the cost of this compensation? We will have also the potential trade losses. As you remember, I presented that risk analysis has been developed particularly for us in animal health in regards of the international trade. So you know that when you are declaring officially the presence of some disease in your country, you could have ban of international trade, and that has to be taken into account in your assessment of the consequence. But you can also take into consideration environmental consequences, the amenity values, the loss of endemic species, and I was thinking particularly with ASF of some specific species that you could have currently with the presence of the disease in Asia, such as warty pigs or Barrenador. But the question could be also for our region regarding peccary. And you should also take into account the consequences in terms of social and cultural and aesthetic conditions. So these consequences can be also divided in three parts. So the sanitary and economic consequences for the farms, so direct and indirect for one farm, so at a microeconomy level. Then the spread of the disease between herds, so regarding the epidemiological nature of the disease in the country. So for ASF, this rapid spread that could occur if you still have animal movement in your country, and if you have also presence of wild animals, as mentioned by Dana, feral pigs, particularly in here. And also the national, so the third level, the national and international consequences of the disease regarding the commodity chain and the macroeconomy. Just some example also of economic consequences for ASF. We talk about animal death, and I mentioned this consideration regarding herd culling. At which level do we cull only animals in infected farms, or do we cull also in a buffer zone? The food losses that will be a consequence of this culling for the population in your country, and the income losses for the farmers. But you will have also this potential decrease in export if you have a ban of trade, and if you were trading a lot of pig, as it was the case, for example, for China. And this could have also some sort of indirect consequences. In the case of China, because they cull and they lost a lot of animals, they stopped importing cereals from, or not completely stopped, but they decreased drastically their importation of cereals from USA. And then after 2018, when the disease appeared in China, you had a drop of cereal market prices at a worldwide level. You could also have some decrease or increase of prices in your country regarding pork, particularly in some countries. We've seen decrease of the prices when the disease was appearing in the region, and where all the farmers tried to sell all the animals before being infected. But you could also then after, when you have a shortage of pork, have an increase of the prices, because you will depend of importation. And this could also have some impact on tourism revenue. This consideration is looking at the OIE handbook on import risk analysis, where you've got assessment of the magnitude of consequences. You need to identify and describe the different outbreak scenario. And you need to distinguish between the consequences when the disease established within the exposed population, but quickly identified and eradicated. The second scenario being having spread before being eradicated. And the third scenario, the disease, so ASF, becoming endemic in your country. So remember also that this consequence assessment approach is a scientific approach, and only needs to focus on these consequences, excluding media and political consequences, which are not relevant in a scientific assessment. So I'm not saying that it's not important, but this will be mainly the role of the politicians and decision makers. And here I was just showing you this on these pictures, a manifestation of people in, I think it's in Philippines, where they were manifesting against the culling of all the pigs. So this has to be taken into account, but at a political level and not at your level in the consequence assessment. And just my last slide about consequence assessment for ASF, the CaribVET risk assessment tool. And you see here, you will see again all these considerations that you will need to give a qualitative to each of them. So the losses on animals, products, and byproduct exportation, the losses related to the exportation of agricultural products, the decrease in pork and byproduct availability, so at the internal market level, the decrease of consumption of pork and byproduct in your country, the impact on the breeding swine population, and also the direct and indirect effects at the different level of production, so small pig producer, medium pig producer, and big pig producers, and the social cost to the swine sector and the impact on cultural practices and identity. And once again, you will qualify all these different consequences, and then some numerical value will be given according to the qualitative level, and a combination of these different value will end up with a global assessment of your consequences in your country. So I will give back the floor to Dana to present you some identification of mitigation in place. Dana.
Okay, I see that there's some questions coming in to the chat box. So I'm going to move quickly through an evaluation of sanitary measures or mitigation options so that we have some time for your questions. We've talked about this already during our seminar today, the various options for reducing risk, either intentional options based on policies of a country or other factors that may not be particularly focused at ASF per se, but are in place in the country that limit risk. So for each of your pathways of entry and exposure, you want to evaluate the impact of all sanitary measures on your likelihood. And again, I mentioned both those that are intentional to limit spread of disease in your country, and those that may be focused on other factors, but nonetheless impact the likelihood of spread, such as how garbage is managed. Again, perhaps garbage is incinerated in the country for reasons other than disease spread. It may be for other health measures related to disposal of garbage, and limiting human factors, but it will be very effective against African swine fever. Baggage inspection is an opportunity at ports of entry. Maybe there's a program or a policy for inspecting international travelers' luggage for pork products or other illegal products, and maybe it is focused on identifying illegal pork products, or maybe it's to look for illegal smuggling. But nonetheless, it may be an effective mechanism of detecting products at the border and limiting their entry and exposure to pigs. Other things is to just prohibit trade with affected countries, perhaps. Again, in the interest of protecting your country from commercial products coming in from ASF affected countries, trade restrictions are in place that may be targeting those countries or may be in place for other reasons, but nonetheless affect the probability or likelihood of ASF contaminated products coming into your country. Surveillance is a key part, obviously, for detection. To agree, there's surveillance in a country in either the pig population or surveillance for contaminated products that decreases the likelihood. Biosecurity on farms that prevent entry of pigs that may be from out of the country, or have quarantine protocols whereby pigs are not allowed to circulate with other pigs until they've gone through a quarantine and testing program on a farm. That's a very good biosecurity factor that could be taken into account. And again, the scavengers, we talked about free roaming pigs that may be scavenging at landfills and being exposed to international garbage that may have arrived from other countries. So again, here's my pathway diagram once again, and every blue arrow then indicates an opportunity for a mitigation or a policy that may reduce the risk of exposure, either movement, taking the product out of the pathway so that it does not result in exposure, does not end up in a landfill, for example, becomes incinerated first, and does not result in exposure. So again, relying on the pathway diagram and considering mitigations, you can consider mitigations that are already in place, but also identify opportunities for new mitigations that you may want to put into place based on your estimated risk of that pathway posing an opportunity to introduce and spread ASF to your susceptible pig population. Of course, we mentioned there's complicating factors associated with all your pathways. Again, feral or free roaming swine complicate your ability to both detect and control a pathway if it gets into a feral swine or free roaming swine population. Again, there's the number of pathways potentially of exposure to your domestic pig population then expands. Consider that now you have a new source within country potentially of spreading, establishing and spreading that pathogen. And in this case, it's very difficult, obviously, to control your wildlife relative to your domestic pig population. So there's opportunities for the virus, the disease to transmit back and forth between wild populations and your domestic population. So it is much more difficult to control, and your pathways expand greatly when you start to consider the opportunity for wildlife or free roaming pigs to be a source of infection in your country. And again, we mentioned the ticks, the soft-bodied ticks, and if ASF were to get established by virtue of feeding on an infected pig, then that, of course, is another exposure pathway that is difficult to mitigate or control. And then finally, I mentioned that after all the likelihood and uncertainty estimates are in from each step in the risk assessment, the entry assessment, the exposure assessment, the consequences are considered and measured, and any mitigations in place are considered, then you can culminate in a risk estimation for each pathway, which Eric is going to go through.
Okay, so this is our last point, this risk estimation. So as mentioned before, we've seen the different level of risk estimation, and then we will need to combine all these different assessments, so the entries, the assessment, the consequences, including the mitigation measure that we could put in place. So as mentioned previously, you could have different type of a combination. We will mainly focus today on the qualitative one, where you will have, in fact, to take into consideration your different events, your different steps, and giving them, for each of them, a certain qualification. So why do we focus on this qualitative risk assessment? Because this is the one that is carried out most of the time. It's the most, let's say, the easiest one, and the most rapid one also, which is very important in our case of African swine fever. And this qualitative risk assessment will also allow us for having more in-depth discussion about some consideration of the risk, particularly where we've got gaps in the scientific knowledge of the regarding our disease or our ASF virus. So we will probably have to consider a discussion about the ASF virus survivability, its distribution, and its level of virulence. You've seen that this last month we have new strains that has been discovered, particularly in China, but also in Eastern Europe, with strain with the lowest virulence level than the common one of the genotype 2 that has spread all over the world now. And we also have to consider now the newly discovered genotype 1 in China, which strains genotype which is seems to be really a very special one, with a very low level of virulence, with more chronic type of the disease. So there are lots of questions about this emergence of genotype 1 in China these last days. And this has to be taken also into consideration. We already mentioned ornithodoros, so the soft ticks and its competence, but we have to, and this is also a gap in science for the moment. We will need to work on it. We will need also to have consideration regarding feral pigs and their role as potential reservoir of the disease. Obviously, we don't have the same climate than in Europe, where you've seen these wild boars being able to maintain, in fact, the disease in the carcass of dead animals through winters. So perhaps it's not completely the same case here, but we will have to consider this potential feral pigs or free-roaming pigs also. So also we will have to discuss about the susceptible populations, the different pig systems according to the different country. This qualitative risk assessment will allow also the discussion about pathways for infected, contaminated product to reach susceptible animals. I've seen some consideration in the chat regarding the potential entry with migrants, or with also military, or with diplomatic luggages that are not inspected. So these are all considerations to be taken into account. And also the consequence of infected animals, as mentioned previously, the economic, political, social, and environmental consequences. So this qualitative assessment, so as mentioned, we will need to give some rating of your different events with some qualitative vocabulary, such as negligible, low, moderate, high. And these different levels should be clearly defined at the beginning of your risk assessment. And you have to consider that there is no, for the moment, international consensus on the number of levels. So if you choose, as in this example, 4 levels, you need to explain why. And you need to give the meaning for probability of event occurrence of each of the terms, and the meanings for the consequences also. Nevertheless, some guides are existing, and particularly developed, the last one developed by FAO, the technical guidelines on rapid risk assessment for animal health threats. And these different categories you can see here have been defined for the probability levels for the use in entry and exposure, and also the different levels for the consequences levels, with all the description of these levels. So I won't enter, but I will just refer to you to this publication from FAO. And once you've got these different levels, obviously, you remember we have different steps or different events to combine. And this was a table from one of the first combination table produced by Zepeda in 1998, where you see combination of first event or step negligible with another one negligible, which give us negligible results of the risk. And also if you see, for example, combination of moderate with high, you obtain a high level of risk. Once again, there are no consensus on the combination of the risk, and you need to be very careful because, for example, in this table, we will have a combination of one event with another one. For example, negligible combined with a low event, which will produce a low level. And in terms, if you transfer that in terms of probability, in terms of quantitative, with quantitative consideration, because the probability is always below 1 or equal to 1, the combination of two values between 0 and 1 will never be higher than the lowest of this value, which means that, in fact, a negligible event combined with a low event should not be higher than negligible. So this is this problem for this first method presented. The combination of negligible with other level could give a higher probability than negligible, which is not good. And also, without numerical assessment, some combinations are not possible. So how to do additions or how to do conditional probability with this type of table. And there is also another consideration. If then you have not only 2 events to combine, but for example, you have 5 events to combine, you will have, for example, the combination of 5 events with high probabilities, which will result in a high probability level. Once again, if you transfer that to quantitative consideration, if you multiply an event with a probability of 0.1 with another event with a probability of 0.1, and you do that 5 times, you will obtain a probability of 0.00001, which means it's a very low probability compared to the first one, which was 0.1. So once again, this table is not good for this type of consideration. So there are new rules that have been developed for combination of this qualitative combination of events. And in these rules, you will have to consider that a probability qualified as null combined with any other probability should give a result always null. A combination between 2 terms gives a result equal to the smallest terms and more often inferior to the smallest. And then you see the table should be symmetric on both sides of the diagonal. And there is a logical progression in terms in rows and columns, but there is still some imperfection because this combination of 5 events of high probability still give high probability. So just to show you that there was a guide also developed in 2008 by the French Agency for Food, Environmental and Occupational Health and Safety, ANSES, and they defined the different, so they gave 10 level for the risk, and they propose, for example, here the combination of exposure probability with release probability. With this 10 different level, you see nil, nearly nil, minute, extremely low, etc. And these new tables follows the rules that I just previously mentioned. There are also considerations in this guide about adding probabilities. So there is no addition of the levels. If assessed probability have different levels, the probability of the sum will correspond to the highest level of the probabilities. And if assessed probabilities have the same levels, the terms of the result could be the term just upper the one of these two probabilities. This was regarding the entry and exposure assessment. Now, if we consider the consequence assessment, once again, we need to define the different level of consequence and say what are these different levels equal to in terms of definition. And as mentioned before, we have to take into consideration different type of consequences. So the consequences at a level of one farmer, the consequences of the spread of the disease at national level, and the national and international economic consequences that you will be able to combine by adding this different level of consequences. Then there is this very complicated step, which is the combination of occurrence and consequences. So the combination of the result of the entry and exposure with the consequences. So once again, there are some rules that has been defined by ANSES in 2008. So for consequence between null and extremely low, combination should reduce the risk estimated. For consequences between very low and not very high, there is a good balance between consequences and occurrence. And for consequences between quite high and very high, combination should increase the risk, which will give us a table which has no more diagonal symmetry. And this is the table proposed by ANSES. And you see here, you've got on the left inside your consequences with the different level and the consideration of the level nearly null to extremely low, which will decrease, in fact, the level of the probability of occurrence, the probability of occurrence being the result of entry and exposure. And you will see that in that case, you will have, for example, here with extremely low, you will decrease the different level of probability of occurrence. So this table should appear a little bit complicated with these 10 levels, but it gives a very good compromise in terms of consideration of this combination of occurrence and consequences. In the very recent guidelines developed by FAO, you will see that this combination of probability of occurrence and consequences are a little bit more simple, but they are not following the rules of exposed by ANSES before. In that case, you will have something a little bit different with only 4 levels, but that are very interesting also, where you will see that, for consequences considered as negligible, you will have also a decrease of the combination of the level of risk at the end when you combine with probability, even with a high level. But if you have a high level of consequences, you see that you will obtain also increasing of the result of the combination, even if the probability is high. So you see that for high level of consequences, you have increase of the level of risk compared to what you obtain with probability, and with negligible consequences, you decrease your final level of risk. Having said that, what is important is for you all to have the best understanding of what you are doing, and to be very transparent on it, and to give the different rules that you are following when you are combining your different risk probabilities and your probabilities with your consequence, and to follow the rules that you've exposed firstly. Last word about the consideration of uncertainty, because this uncertainty has to be taken into account, as mentioned by Dana previously, even in qualitative models. And you can take that into account with a different level of certainty and having uncertainty for each step, and then a global estimation of your uncertainty. Here you've got also these examples of level of uncertainty given by the FAO guidelines, where you have, for example, for a low level of uncertainty, it means that information and data that are relevant to the rapid risk assessment, consistent and not conflicting, are available, and there are no subjective judgments introduced, and the published data can be used. On the contrary, if you have a high level of uncertainty, it means that you are referring mainly on unpublished data, and there are subjective judgments that can be introduced without supporting evidence. When you can only present the uncertainty qualitatively, you might consider the possible direction on the order of magnitude of the potential error also in your consideration of uncertainty. So here I gave you some example at each step. For example, the entry assessment that was previously called the release assessment. So for pork imports, you will have uncertainty about the official data that are available, but you have a lack of central recording, for example. And in that case, the direction of the error is unknown, and you give the magnitude of this uncertainty, which is major. For example, also for entry assessment, you consider the informal trade. You will say that there are no official data available, and the estimation are done through interviews and personal observation. So you may have an overestimation of the risk if you consider that people will always overestimate when you do your interview. But you could say also that the direction of the error is unknown and the magnitude is high. And you could do that for all the different levels that you consider. So the biosecurity and cleaning measure at farm levels, where you refer on expert reports, personal observation, but also the surveillance system, or the volume of pig production, which is based on census on expert reports also, which could, for example, underestimate your risk, but with a low magnitude. For the consequences also, you need to give some level of uncertainty. For example, for the public health, at public health level, so are there some previous outbreaks reporting? For the farmer income, do you have a good estimation of these incomes? It has been done by expert report, so perhaps you have an underestimate of the risk at this level. And for trading, the consequence on trading, if you have no official data available of the current trade, it will be obviously difficult to give some value of the impact of the ban of trading, for example. So regarding this qualitative risk analysis and estimation, final estimation of the qualitative final estimation of the risk, as you've seen, it's based on logical discussion of the risk using non-numerical terms. So as mentioned before, it is easier and quicker to implement than a quantitative approach. It does not require a lot of quantitative data, and the result can be used quickly to inform subsequent quantitative risk analysis, but also to already take some decision. Some people say that with qualitative approach, you have more subjectivity, but in fact, the subjectivity is also present when you are doing quantitative approach, because most of the time you have a lack of data or high uncertainty, which can result in a quantitative risk analysis with little meaning or validity. So it's better to have a very good qualitative risk assessment than to have a will of doing quantitative approach, but with no sufficient data. What is very important at the end for your assessment is the transparency and the use of a structured framework. So having all the steps well described and not missing any of them. So with that being said, I think I'm done with my presentation, and I guess that we can open the floor now for discussion. Back to you, Erika.
Muchísimas gracias, Eric.
Thank you very much, Eric and Dana. Wonderful presentations. It has certainly been seen with all the questions coming in through the chat box and the Q&A box that it has raised much interest. So thank you so much for sharing. We will do our best to keep sharing information with the countries. Just as a reminder, you can continue asking questions through the chat box. It's open and available for that. We have received several questions already. And so the idea in any case for this Q&A session is for you to use the chat feature. So for Dana and Eric, I will ask the questions myself. So I'll read it out to you and then you can respond. And you can decide whether it's going to be Dana or Eric, because they're not directed specifically to any of you. So you choose who can answer each of the questions.
¿Quién las contesta? Bueno, entonces voy a empezar con
And so let me ask the first question. We have, is there an international standard for each country to have a laboratory at ports of entry so that there can be lab tests done to animals before entering the territory?
Eric o Dana, por favor.
Eric or Dana?
I can start, and then maybe Eric wants to add. There are international standards for laboratories to set up laboratories for diagnostic testing, to establish validated testing methods and meet certain international criteria for quality. However, there aren't criteria for requiring laboratory testing at the border with any particular test or any particular surveillance program, that whether a country tests at the point of entry is up to the policies of that country. So there is a difference between establishing laboratory standards for testing versus how you apply those laboratory standards and develop your surveillance program.
Eric, ¿vas a complementar
Eric,
algo?
do you want to add anything or should we go on?
No, I don't want to add anything. I think it's quite complete.
Gracias. Gracias,
Thank you.
Dana. Gracias, Eric.
And thank you, Dana.
Okay, la otra pregunta es,
Another question. It's several questions actually in one, so you might want to take note. It's a long one. I'll go slowly so that you can get it all. From the epidemiological standpoint, what is the importance we could attribute to immigration from Haiti? Are there any studies on the likelihood of introduction or entry to other countries based on those that we already have for the Americas, such as Dominican Republic and Haiti. I think I'll leave it there. And so as you answer, I can add anything.
Okay, it's quite a complicated question because it has also some political consideration in the question. What is important and just to answer directly, I haven't seen any scientific studies related to the risk of introduction of disease related to immigration, legal or illegal immigration currently. But what I can just highlight is that for the human factor is very important in the spread of the ASF disease. Regarding, for example, what happened when it appears in 2007 in Russia, we had this very slow spread of the disease at the beginning through contact of animals and with wild boars also. And suddenly, after 2 or 3 months, we had a jump of more than 3,000 kilometers within the Russian Federation, which was after discussion with authority, it was mainly due, but it was still a supposition because it was not proved. But what people consider is that at this moment in the area where Georgia, and the border with Georgia, where the disease emerged in these years, there was some military contingency of Russian people, and there were some change in these militaries that were present there, and they went back to their home, and probably some of them took some food with them, some piece of pork, and they took the train and back to St. Petersburg, where the disease also emerged, but without any spread in between the two regions, which showed us really that it was due to human transportation. But we have to consider it's not only, so obviously, when you look at probability, the more you have people moving from one point to another point, the more risk is important. But remember also that only one person can introduce the disease. So this is important in terms of surveillance, that you have to consider each of the pathway, and each of the, not consider only one type of population, but consider all the population coming from one point. And when we are talking, for example, in our case, looking at population coming, for example, from China, it's not only coming from by plane from a Chinese airport, but also it could come from another airport which is a hub, and the people came from, for example, from Beijing to Panama, and then from Panama to another place where they will stop their travel. And that's why it's very complicated to assess this type of things. And I've seen also in the chat at certain stage the importance of the surveillance in port and airports, and the role of dogs in this surveillance, particularly when we are talking about animal products, illegal transportation of animal products, but also the importance of sensitization of the people who are traveling. So this was more or less my answer. I don't know if Dana wants to add to it.
No, I think that was very thorough. We could take another question.
Muchísimas gracias, Eric. De hecho,
Thank you very much, Eric. In fact, there was a comment related to the Russian example, so you covered it beautifully. And the second part of this question is, what circumstances under the current situation in America can be attributed to couriers or postal remittances can be attributed to this?
Well, I can share my screen again for this one. So again, similar to Eric's answer for the last one, it's not, there's not good scientific data or proof of, the risk, the actual nature of the risk with postal cargo products. So I want to go back to the pathways and think about the cargo pathway a little bit, because of course, for cargo, particularly if it's being mailed to family members or persons as a gift, we can consider that most likely it may be consumed, in which case there's no exposure. So you need to think out what is the whole pathway and what are the opportunities to mitigate that pathway to prevent exposure, because there are many scientists who speculate that ASF may have already in some countries entered. There were some data, I think, from Australia where they tested products confiscated from baggage that showed there was ASF. However, ASF entry must be followed by exposure. So I think this is where it's very difficult to determine what is the risk, because the cargo could be, most of these products may be consumed. So you need to consider what is the waste pathway. Where is that product that's not consumed going? Is it going into a landfill? If yes, are there free roaming pigs accessing that landfill? If not, if there aren't free roaming pigs, then is there garbage feeding in that country? And so I think in this regard, it's important, again, to consider the entire pathway, not just entry, but also the opportunities to consider exposure. And so, as I mentioned, while the cargo pathway or the mail pathway may be very high risk from the standpoint of it's very likely something contaminated could enter, then it may not be very high risk when you consider the more limited number of ways that pigs could be exposed to those products that were shipped in via mail.
Gracias, Dana.
Thank you, Dana. The next question is, in the case of African swine fever, shouldn't we consider the risk of introduction by soft ticks? Also, another question along these same lines, talking about ticks. If you know the distribution and the vector capability of soft ticks in America.
Okay, so as I previously said, regarding soft ticks, there are presence of some specific ornithodoros, so Puerto Ricensis, in the Caribbean region, for example. And previously studies that have been done on these soft ticks were mainly with genotype 1 and not with this genotype 2. So it's quite difficult to give some clear answer about the competency of these soft ticks regarding genotype 2. And secondly, the distribution of these ticks. There have been some works done, but the one I know are more than 20 or 30 years ago done. So it was quite a long time, and they probably need an update now. And regarding presence of soft ticks in Central or in South America, I don't have a lot of information, but perhaps some of our colleagues could give that. And if not, obviously this is an important gap, scientific gap that needs to be looked at.
Gracias, Eric. No sé si Dana
Thank you,
quiere.
Eric. I don't know if Dana would like to add anything.
No, thank you.
Okay, en esa misma línea.
Very well. Along these same lines, talking about ticks, I have another question that says, what likelihood would you allocate to transmission by ticks and by the warthog, Tecohiles tajacu, in the Americas?
As previously said, I don't have information regarding this question. I can't answer now to this question. Really sorry for that, but I don't have the scientific data for that. Dana?
Yes, I agree with you, Eric. I don't have any data, but again, a single soft tick may enter. And again, we have to consider on the exposure side the likelihood of not only entry, but exposure, establishment and spread. So that one soft tick or those few soft ticks would need to also be established in a country to contribute to spread. So in the absence of an in-country reservoir for a continuous transmission between vector in animals, the risk is not as high as in countries where you do have both the vector and the wildlife reservoir and an establishment in that country. So those are factors to consider. But again, as Eric said, we can't, quantitatively assess that right now for the Americas because of the absence of those factors.
Just to add to what Dana said, regarding this Ornithodoros puertoricensis, we have also to consider the ecology of these ticks. And this tick is not really a tick that dedicates its life to mammals, or to big mammals, to domestic animals or like this. And the ecology of the ticks is very important because if the ticks is more dedicated to birds or to small rodents, it will be much unlikely that the tick will get into contact with the pigs, and then from a pigs to another one. And if we look a little bit of the spread of the disease with ticks, for example, as it occurs in Southern Africa, it's really something that is in link with the wild reservoirs such as warthogs or bush pigs, which we don't have here in Caribbean or South America or Latin America. And these ticks, they live in the burrows of the warthogs, and they feed on the warthogs for a very short period of time, and then they drop. And so the likelihood also of transportation of these ticks on the warthogs is very low. It could exist. We've proved that we can find these ticks on warthogs that has been shot, but it's a very low probability. And considering the importance of the other pathway of introduction or of spread of the disease, I would really consider for first and a rapid risk assessment not to spend too much time on that, even if from a scientific point of view, I'm very interested in having more information on it, but really looking at the situation, the regional situation, what is for me very important is the consideration of the risk in link with the introductions through animals products or fomites that could result in the introduction in a new country of the region of African swine fever.
Gracias, Eric. Gracias, Dana. Vamos con otra
Thank you,
pregunta.
Eric. Thank you, Dana. Let's move on to another question. It says the virus may remain in cured or semi-cured sausages. And what is the importance of the transportation of risk products by travelers in relation to other pathways of introduction?
So obviously you can have maintenance of the virus in cured products and also in frozen products. Having these frozen products being the best way of maintaining your virus for a very long time. It could be more than a year in this frozen product. So it's a very good way of maintaining the survival of the virus and being able to spread it then after. So I think this is something very important to consider, this pathway regarding the pork products and either sausages or even all this ham, cured ham and this type of products, and that can be easily transported by people coming back to see their family in one place and just sharing. But you have also to keep in mind that if it occurs, it means that this person have to go back or to share this meal, and to at a certain stage that they are not consuming this totally, and then the rest of the product will be given to some other pigs. So we should have the complete chain in order to have a real introduction of the virus in the country. But obviously, this is a really important pathway to consider.
¿Ibas a agregar algo, Daina?
Were you going to add anything, Dana?
Yes. So it is, as Eric said, a very important pathway to consider. The answer to the question about its relative importance is relative to the country and the policies they have in place. For example, if there are trade restrictions on any commercial trade in these products from ASF affected countries, then of course this uncontrolled pathway of international travelers becomes very important, because steps have been taken to rule out other pathways. But in countries where they may not have controls at the border for commercial product trade, then that commercial product trade may be more important relatively, simply because of the volume, because products are being imported to feed the population, for example. So you have an uncontrolled pathway if you don't have trade restrictions in place. So the answer of the importance, all these pathways are very important, but the factors, described about the volume and frequency come into play as far as relatively which pathway is the most likely or the most risky pathway to a particular country. It's going to vary country by country based on their, imports of food, sources of food, policies at the border, and as well as tourism and travel.
Muchas gracias, Dana, y muchas
Thank you
gracias.
very much, Dana. Thank you very much, Eric. Following this same subject matter, they're asking us, at the airports, how effective is the detection of risk material by canine units? What factors may incur into or lead to uncertainty? And the other question is it convenient to assess all products and byproducts of swine origin that has been confiscated, or is it better to just eliminate them safely?
I'm not an expert in the canine, but we do have canine units in the United States as part of our safeguard for detecting products. And in that case, there is uncertainty. There's uncertainty associated with how many travelers are going past a canine. And so the volume, we get back to volume, how many dogs are available, and again, the volume. So the uncertainty in the effectiveness comes into, just the sheer number of detecting dogs at ports of entry, how many ports of entry have dogs. We try to put our dogs at the highest risk, most ports with the most travelers from countries, but to have dogs at every port, or we can't necessarily have them at every port of entry, every airport, every land entry, and that sort of thing. And as Eric highlighted earlier, passengers can come and change planes and that sort of thing. So you can have dogs at one port and passengers come through a different port through a plane connection or something along those lines, for example. So it's really, there's a lot of sources of uncertainty as far as an individual dog and its effectiveness. I think they've been demonstrated to be pretty effective at through the training program to sniff out products and do result in many confiscations of products here in the United States. I'm sorry, I forgot the second half of that question.
Just to complete what Dana said regarding dogs, I don't have any doubt about the efficiency of the dogs themselves. When you see that they are trained also to diagnose diseases such as cancer, and more recently with COVID, they've done very good studies, and they are used in some countries.
Eric?
Yes? Yes? Do you hear me? Hello?
Creo que...
Yes.
Yes, do you hear me? Erika? Do you hear me?
Ahora sí, ahora sí.
Yes, I'm sorry. My screen froze. Yeah, go ahead now.
Okay.
But we were hearing you. I'm sorry for that.
Okay. I was just explaining that I have no doubt about the capacities of dogs to find if any some animal products in luggages, but as explained by Dana, it depends also of the number of canine units you can deploy in your port. But there are also another consideration to have, is that even if you don't have a lot of these dogs, their presence is also a sort of a message that you send to the passengers. And when passengers knows that in this airport, for example, they've got this canine units, they are less inclined, willing to transport illegal products such as pork in their luggages. So it has also this this effect of avoiding people to do this illegal things. And once again, sensitization of passengers is also very important, particularly not only at the arrival, but at the port, the airport where they are taking the plane. It's also very important to have this global information about the fact that introduction of animal products in this country is illegal.
Sí, la segunda pregunta consistía
Yes, the second part of the question consisted in the do you recommend assessing all products or byproducts of swine origin that are confiscated, or would it be better to dispose of them safely?
That is a question of resources and how the results will be used. So for the most part, we simply don't have the resources to test all products or identify the risk for any particular confiscated product. And if you did have the resources to test a subset of products, you'd have to know what the intended use of that information was, because of course it's only a subset and it could be a biased subset, as I mentioned before about sources of uncertainty and biases. So, the resource constraints related to testing confiscated products and the limited use of the data, except in some research settings, and being able to, maybe better qualify or quantitate a specific risk, from a research perspective, I don't think, there's a lot of benefit necessarily to that because of the limited data collection and resources relative to the volume you'd need. So I think in that case, just the policy there is to eliminate the risk and eliminate the probability of exposure, in which case you confiscate and incinerate or make sure that the product is destroyed, so that you have you've eliminated the risk of introduction associated with that entry.
Muchas gracias, Dana. Y muchas gracias a Eric.
Thank you very much, Dana. Thank you very much, Eric. Let's move on to the next question. How to create synergy between two bordering countries to limit the risk level?
I can start, and Eric may have some great follow-up ideas. I think it's a great question. It's obviously very important to work with your border countries to identify ways that you can work together to protect each other. So I think the first part is, assess your country's risk, identify, the risk associated with, various ports of entry, including your neighboring countries, where you identify pathways that include your country, your neighbor country. And then from that point, you have, a basis to have bilateral conversations and talk about that, especially if your neighbor country is doing the same thing and assessing their risks and assessing, where that commonality is at the port. And by having that conversation, coming together, and saying and comparing your assessments, and then maybe there's opportunities for you to partner on the mitigation, and share the resources, if you will. So maybe have an agreement about how animals will be, assessed at the border between you based on your own assessments of your risk. So neither country may have it endemically, but both may have policies that they've identified, or they have pathways of concern such that they want to talk mutually about how to assess animals at a port, or how to where the greatest volume is in one country versus the other. So if one country has huge commercial seaports and its neighbor does not, perhaps the agreement or the conversation centers on what country with the huge seaport can do at that entry point, and then what the neighboring country can do on their end as far as the pass-through or limiting exposure for those products that may be coming from that major seaport into their country. And there can be some conversations between the two countries about how best to protect each other and their susceptible pigs.
Eric, ¿ibas a decir algo?
Eric, you were going to say something.
I think that Dana answered very well the question. It's really a political issue, but an important one in terms of a synergy between neighboring countries. And obviously, in the best of the world, it would be very easy to explain people that working together will allow us to have a better efficiency in the control of these diseases, particularly transboundary diseases. But obviously, between countries, you don't have only a sanitary consideration, but you've got lots of other considerations, such as economical ones, or even from a higher importance for the country. But other thing that may also give a break a little bit to the cooperation in terms of a sanitary collaboration. But it should be shown as really something when we are collaborating together that will have more effect than each of them working alone on each side of the borders. And therefore, I think there are some possibility of doing that, and they could be also some helps coming from international agency that could really highlight the importance of this collaboration.
Gracias, Eric. Gracias, Dana.
Thank you, Eric and Dana. We are going to allow for 2 more questions because we really have so many questions, but in the interest of time, we are going to offer the opportunity for 2 more questions. The question is there the possibility of entry of African swine fever due to import of contaminated semen?
Dana or Eric?
Dana or Eric?
Yes, the short answer is yes. Semen collected from infected pigs is a risk, has been determined to be a potentially risky tissue that may be able to transmit. And so it is being looked at scientifically as a potential method of transmission if collected from an infected pig.
Gracias, Dana.
Thank you. And the last question, how can we mitigate the risk of entry of ASF through products such as antibiotics, minerals, and others for pigs imported from affected countries?
Can you repeat the question? I don't really understand the introduction of ASF through medicines.
Sí, bueno, en realidad es bastante amplia.
It's quite broad. It says introducing the virus through flours or meals, minerals. They do mention antibiotics from countries that are affected.
Okay, no, the answer is you can't introduce the virus through antibiotics or flours. what is important is you can introduce the virus through the ground that could be on either on under your shoes, or if you are traveling with cars or trucks, it could be also introduced that way, because as mentioned before, the virus is very resistant in the environment, and where in an environment that has been contaminated. So, for example, somebody who was visiting a farm with infected pigs and who was walking in some places where there was some secretion of the infected animals, or where animals were slaughtered, there they could transport the virus through the shoes or through the wheels of the cars and things like that. But directly from I mean, minerals, flowers, or things like that, no, it's really where the virus could be present. So obviously, if you could have all the cases. If you take a flower with the ground from a place where there was some infected animals, you've got a risk, but usually it's not this case. So, but what is important is, yes, to consider the fomites and all this possibility of having the virus entering through some grounds, or through what is transported in wheels or shoes or things like that. You know, Dana, if you want to complete.
Yeah, I think you described it well, Eric. It's about, the presence of animal tissues in products, and that is really the issue that we're talking about, and what are the opportunities for those tissues and products to come in on fomites, as you mentioned.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. We still do have questions. We won't be able to answer them, but time is running out for our session. So on social media, we will post some information, and also emails and contact information, so that you can send us the questions you have, and we can then ask Dana and Eric. I also invite you now to please turn your cameras on, as we will be taking a picture of the event. So if please everyone could switch their cameras on. And while we have everyone on view, don't forget that next Tuesday, the 16th of November, at this same time, we have the continuation
a varios temas en análisis de riesgo para peste porcina africana.
For risk analysis on ASF. Remember that. Put it in your agenda. We still have 3 more webinars, so just waiting for everyone to switch their cameras on. And while we wait, I'd like to congratulate Dana and Eric for wonderful presentations. There's still so many questions, which is good, but we're in the process of sharing the information, so we look forward to continuing these seminars. I think we have everyone with their cameras on, so just let me know, Ninive or Juanita, when you are taking the picture, to be sure. I think we still have people who haven't switched their cameras on. We actually have very few on. Please go ahead, everyone. Don't be shy. It's important to record these events. So please, everyone.
Si no, Juanita. con los que estamos.
If not, let's just take it with those of us who are on. Some people are telling me that they don't have access to their cameras, so.
Listo, Erika, ya está la foto.
Okay, so we do have the picture already. For the next time, we'll correct it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for your time, and we will see you back on Tuesday for the next conference. Have a great day. Thanks, everyone.